He didn't bark. He didn't growl. He just sat beside a rusted truck and refused to move. That German shepherd wasn't guarding a weapon. He was guarding a memory. A burned metal capsule hidden under the seat held more than ash. It held a story of sacrifice, brotherhood, and a love that refused to die. When a veteran broke down for the first time in 10 years, it wasn't because of war. It was because a dog reminded him he was never alone. If you believe some dogs are sent by God to help heal what words cannot, share this video with someone who needs hope. Comment Amen if you believe miracles come in fur and silence. Subscribe for more true stories of faith, loyalty, and healing. May God bless everyone who watches. The Arizona heat bore down hard on the cracked asphalt of Flagstaff's VA Medical Center parking lot. It was barely 9:15 a.m., but the sun was already brutal. Hazy waves shimmered across rows of parked cars while the scent of scorched rubber and engine oil lingered in the air. A faint breeze swept dry dust in small curls against the base of the hospital's concrete walls. To the east, the jagged peaks of the San Francisco mountains loomed, their blue-gray silhouettes softened by heat haze. This was the kind of morning where you could taste the metal in the air. And for Sergeant Ethan Brooks, it was just another routine patrol. At least, that's what it was supposed to be. Ethan was in his late 30s, standing at 6 feet 1 inch, with a build that spoke more of endurance than brute strength. His sandy brown hair peeked out beneath his patrol cap, sweat already darkening the rim. He wore the Flagstaff Police Department's summer uniform, short sleeves, utility belt snug on his hips, badge glinting in the sun. Ethan's face was weathered but calm. A quiet seriousness settled deep in his hazel eyes that had seen more than their share of pain, most of which he never talked about. A 6-year veteran of patrol, he had transferred to the K-9 unit 3 years ago after a car crash claimed his partner, Officer Danny Ruiz. Since then, Ethan rarely smiled without effort. He didn't joke much anymore. But when he worked with Ranger, something softened in him. Ranger, a 4-year-old German shepherd, walked beside him with fluid grace. The dog was magnificent, 85 pounds of lean muscle and alert focus, his coat a rich blend of sable and charcoal black. His ears were tall and constantly twitching, processing even the subtlest sounds. His tail was low but loose, his breathing steady, and his stride matched Ethan's like they'd been born to walk side by side. Ranger had an intensity in his eyes that made strangers pause, not aggression but depth. Trained in explosives detection and suspect apprehension, he had been top of his class at the K-9 Academy. But more than that, Ranger had a calm, calculating aura, like he saw through the world and kept his judgments to himself. The parking lot was only about half full, with cars arranged in sun-blasted rows. Some were dusty sedans, others were polished SUVs bearing yellowed veteran tags and faded military decals. Ethan walked past a Buick with a Vietnam bumper sticker and a Ford Escape with a POW MIA license plate frame. He offered a quiet nod to a passing older man in a wheelchair, who raised 2 fingers in return. "Another scorcher," Ethan muttered, wiping sweat from his brow. "Ain't that right, Ranger?" The dog offered no response, just kept walking, nose low and scanning. Ethan unclipped the leash, trusting Ranger to do his job. They moved into Section B of the lot, row after row of mostly ordinary vehicles. As they neared the middle of row 6, Ethan's thoughts drifted back to Ranger's early days. He remembered the first weeks of training at the academy, when Ranger would stubbornly ignore commands if Ethan's tone shifted even slightly. The dog was sensitive, not in a fragile way, but in a way that demanded trust be earned, not assumed. There was one particular moment Ethan would never forget. A rainy night training exercise where he slipped in the mud during a simulated pursuit, spraining his ankle. Ranger had stopped cold, circled back, and refused to leave Ethan's side despite the instructor yelling for him to complete the drill. That was the moment Ethan knew. This dog wasn't just smart. He was loyal to the core. Now, with 3 years of partnership behind them, Ethan rarely questioned Ranger's instincts. They were halfway through row 6 when it happened. Without a sound or signal, Ranger halted. His head snapped left. Then, in a slow and deliberate motion, He sat down beside a battered, dust-covered Chevy Silverado. Ethan's pulse kicked up. Ranger didn't just sit. He locked into position. Ears forward, tail stiff, muscles tense like wire beneath his coat. His body vibrated with focused tension. "Ranger," Ethan said, his voice low. No response. The truck was old, dented hood, spiderwebbed windshield, a Marine Corps sticker half peeled on the back window. The Arizona plates were sun-faded. A ragged American flag air freshener dangled in the rearview mirror, unmoving in the heat. Ranger's gaze was fixed on the space beneath the passenger seat. Ethan circled the truck slowly, scanning for anything obvious. Loose wiring, gas smells, strange packages. Nothing. But Ranger remained still as stone. "Talk to me, boy," then a voice called out. "Excuse me, is that Ranger?" Ethan turned. A man in his 60s approached, khaki pants, polo shirt tucked neatly despite the heat. A badge on his lanyard read, Dr. Harold Tennyson, DVM. His gray hair was tied back in a loose ponytail, and his gentle demeanor radiated through his soft green eyes. "He trained at my facility," the man said, eyes misting. "Back when he was barely out of puppyhood. They said he was special. Not just smart, intuitive." Ethan nodded. "Yeah, he's saved more than one life with that intuition." "Dr." Tennyson crouched carefully, his knees cracking. "He's alerting on something, isn't he?" "Looks that way. I always told the handlers, dogs like him have a sixth sense. Not supernatural, just deep. They don't always react to what's visible. Sometimes it's what's left behind. Memory sent grief. It stays." Ethan glanced back at Ranger. The dog hadn't moved. Tennyson smiled faintly. "He's not just looking at that truck. He's remembering something." Ethan didn't respond, but the knot forming in his stomach spoke for him. He raised his radio. "Dispatch, Unit 14. I've got a K9 alert in the VA lot, row 6. Requesting a plate check on Arizona tag 8H, LZ28. Chevy Silverado, gray marine decal." "Copy that, Unit 14. Stand by." The old vet gave Ethan a pat on the shoulder and nodded. He remembers things people try to forget. "I'll let you two work." As the man walked away, Ethan crouched beside Ranger, his voice barely a whisper. "What do you smell, partner?" Ranger didn't break posture, didn't move an inch. He simply stared beneath that passenger seat. And Ethan, for all his training, felt something cold move across his spine despite the heat. This was not a false alert. This was something else. Something remembered. Something sacred. And Ranger wasn't going anywhere. The Silverado sat baking beneath the Arizona sun, its dented hood glinting like armor dulled by time. Ranger hadn't budged. The heat radiated from the asphalt in shimmering ripples, but the German Shepherd's focus was unshakable, still locked on the passenger seat of the battered truck. Ethan stood a few paces back, one hand resting instinctively on his utility belt, the other holding his radio loosely, as if expecting some hidden truth to crackle through it. Then he heard the soft crunch of gravel behind him, measured, slow footsteps that didn't carry the shuffle of curiosity, but the weight of familiarity. Ethan turned. The man approaching was in his early 40s, maybe 45 at most, but his face held the etched lines of someone who'd lived a life twice that. He was tall, 6 feet, maybe more, but lean in a wiry, functional way. His t-shirt was a plain gray, stretched taut across shoulders that had seen combat. Faded denim jeans and scuffed brown boots completed the look. But it was his eyes that gave Ethan pause. Gray-blue, intense but hollow, like a man who had witnessed too much and kept every memory sealed behind a wall of discipline. Jake Callahan stopped 5 feet from the truck and stared at Ranger. Then at Ethan. "That's my vehicle," he said, voice low, unhurried. It wasn't a challenge. It wasn't even a question. Ethan nodded. "Sergeant Ethan Brooks, Flagstaff PD. This is Ranger. Your truck triggered an alert. Mind if we ask you a few questions?" Jake's eyes never left Ranger. "He's not wrong," he said, almost to himself. The silence between the men wasn't tense, it was heavy. Ethan took a step closer. "Sir, do you know if there's anything in the vehicle that might cause a trained explosives dog to react?" Jake hesitated. Then he sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. Depends what you consider explosive. That cryptic response was cut short by the sound of laughter nearby. A group of teenagers in matching blue volunteer shirts rounded the corner of the building. 4 of them, 2 girls and 2 boys, carried clipboards and trash grabbers, the kind given to kids helping out for summer community service credit. The tallest girl, with a messy bun and oversized sunglasses, spotted Ranger and gasped. "Oh my God, is that a police dog?" she said, already walking over. Ethan raised a hand calmly. "Hey guys, I need you to give us some space. We're in the middle of an active alert here." The teens paused, unsure. But then a shorter boy with braces and a sunburned neck spoke up. "We're just helping pick up around the lot. You guys catch a bad guy or something?" Ethan offered a small smile, the professional kind. "Not quite. Ranger's doing his job. Just needs quiet to work." The girl in the sunglasses frowned, her curiosity undeterred. "So what does he do exactly? How do dogs even know where to sniff?" Ethan glanced at Ranger, still rigid beside the Silverado. "Dogs don't think like us," he said finally. "They don't reason, don't guess. They just know what's there. Or what was there. They don't lie." That answer seemed to settle the kids for a moment. Then one of the boys said, "Cool," and they wandered back the way they came. Jake watched them go, expression unreadable. "They don't lie," he repeated, quieter. "Wish I could say the same for people." Ethan studied him. "You military?" Jake gave a short nod. "SEAL Team 3. Discharged 2011. Retired after some injuries and other stuff." There was no need for Ethan to press. The look in Jake's eyes, he knew it. Not from personal service, but from years of watching it in others. A kind of ache that didn't scream or bleed. It simply remained. Ethan gestured toward the truck. "Ranger won't move. He's alerting under the passenger seat." That usually means one of 2 things: current trace residue, or something that meant a lot to someone, and maybe still does. Jake didn't flinch. "He's right. I've carried something in there for a long time." Ethan nodded slowly. "Then we'll need to take a look, with your permission." Jake didn't respond right away. He moved closer to the truck, stepping into the sun fully now, casting a long shadow beside Ranger. The dog didn't even glance up. He just remained locked in position, still as a memorial statue. "Damn," Jake muttered. "He knows, doesn't he?" "He remembers," Ethan said. "Even when we try to forget." The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was reverent. Jake finally gave a slight nod. "You can open it, but you're going to want to know what you're touching." Ethan raised an eyebrow, but didn't speak. Jake took a deep breath. "It's not dangerous. It's not active. But it's part of someone. Someone I lost. And I couldn't leave it behind." Ethan didn't move yet. He waited, sensing the weight behind Jake's words. Just then, another voice called out from across the parking lot. A woman mid-30s, wearing hospital scrubs and pushing a supply cart. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a tight ponytail, and despite the sweat on her brow, she moved with crisp precision. Her name tag read Nina Acker, RN. "Everything okay, officer?" she called, shielding her eyes from the sun. Ethan nodded. "All good, ma'am. Just some routine security work." Nina gave a nod of acknowledgement and continued rolling her cart down the pavement, barely giving Jake a glance. Jake watched her go. "I come here every Tuesday," he said quietly. "Not for meds. Just to sit with guys who understand. I don't talk much, but I bring it with me." Ethan finally stepped to the door, hand resting on the handle. "Let's take a look then. Together." As he pulled open the passenger side door, a rush of heat escaped, along with the faint smell of old canvas and oil. Beneath the seat, something wrapped in tightly sealed olive drab material caught the light. But Ethan didn't touch it, not yet. Ranger leaned in, nose twitching, then exhaled through his nostrils and gave the softest whine. Jake knelt beside him and said, barely above a whisper, "Yeah, buddy. I miss him too." And for a moment, there were no sirens. No patrols. No orders or protocols. Just 2 men, 1 dog, and a silence too sacred to fill. The heat had settled into a heavy stillness. No breeze, no movement, just the slow hum of hospital air conditioning units and the occasional squawk of distant crows. Ethan crouched beside the open passenger door of the Silverado, his flashlight cutting a pale beam into the shadows beneath the seat. Ranger sat rigid, still watching that hidden space as though it held something sacred or haunted. Jake stood just behind him, arms crossed, body rigid with a kind of tension that didn't belong to the present. It belonged to a memory. The object came into view, a package wrapped in olive canvas, frayed at the edges, its surface caked with dust and flecks of dry red earth. Ethan hesitated. This wasn't the kind of thing you touched without permission, not for legal reasons, but for emotional ones. He turned his head slightly. "Jake," he said, "you want to tell me what this is before I reach in?" Jake shifted his weight and let out a slow exhale. "It's not a threat, Sergeant. Just years of silence in one small shell." Ethan studied him. Jake wasn't blinking. His voice didn't shake. Whatever was in that bundle, it mattered. Slowly, Ethan reached in, his gloved hand sliding across the hot floor of the truck. The bundle was heavier than it looked. As he pulled it free, a sharp scent clung to the canvas, old oil, singed metal, and something acrid that reminded Ethan of charred rope. He placed the object gently on the truck's hood, the canvas darkening under the weight of sweat dripping from his forehead. Ranger stood and walked over, not with urgency but reverence. The dog sat beside the hood and fixed his gaze on the package again. His breathing slowed. His ears remained forward, but his eyes had changed, less sharp, more quiet. Jake approached but didn't reach out. His hand hovered a few inches above the object, as if the very act of touching it might summon something best left buried. "You ever held a memory that burned your hands, Ethan?" he asked quietly. Ethan didn't answer right away. His mind flashed back, Richmond, 2019, a night patrol gone wrong. A robbery call turned hostage situation. Officer Carla James and her K9 Max were first through the back door. The explosion wasn't from the front. It came from the basement, a homemade device they never saw coming. Max absorbed most of it. Carla survived, barely. Ethan had been on site, 2 minutes behind. He still heard the sound of Max's whimper in his dreams. So yes, he knew what Jake meant. "Yeah," Ethan said softly. "I have." They stood there a moment longer before Ethan carefully peeled back the first layer of canvas. Inside was a dull gray cylinder, roughly the size of a thermos, scorched and pitted like it had survived a fire. A faint serial code was etched along one edge, barely legible. The surface was grooved in places, intentional markings, perhaps, while others bore the unmistakable pattern of blunt force damage. Jake finally touched it, his fingers tracing the damage. "It's not a weapon. It's what we called a memory capsule. Not standard issue. Just a field thing. Started carrying it after the first time we lost a guy and couldn't recover the body." Ethan nodded. "So you saved what you could." Jake's jaw tightened. "Sometimes a patch. A dog. A collar. Once it was just dirt. But this one is Blaze." Ethan looked up. "Blaze?" Jake smiled, just barely. "German Shepherd. Deployed with us in Mosul. Tactical K9, trained in detection, search and protection. Smartest damn creature I ever met. Smarter than most men. He didn't just follow orders. He anticipated them." There was a stillness in Jake's expression now, like something fragile had been released. "Blaze didn't die in battle," Jake continued. "He saved us from it. Found the IED buried under gravel before the route clearance team could. But when I turned to give the hand signal," he paused. He was already on it. "Too fast. Took the hit. I wasn't 10 feet behind." Ethan lowered his eyes. "I'm sorry." Jake gave a half nod. "I don't talk about him. Never did. Just carried the capsule, told myself it was enough. But now your dog shows up and looks at it like it's a living thing. And I'm not sure anymore." Ranger moved closer, his nose brushing gently against the capsule. Then he sat. Not alert. Not tense. Just present. The moment stretched, an odd quiet suspended in time. Then footsteps again. A new figure approached from the side of the hospital, a slender woman with shoulder-length blonde curls pulled into a low bun. She wore business casual clothes, a visitor's badge clipped to her blouse, and walked with the ease of someone who'd spent a lifetime moving among wounded souls. This was Dr. Leah Monroe, a licensed trauma therapist with the VA. In her early 40s, Leah had a reputation for gentle intensity. She listened with her whole presence, but she didn't pull punches when it came to healing. "Officer Brooks?" she asked, her voice soft but direct. "One of my nurses said you might need someone from our trauma unit." Ethan turned slightly, gestured toward Jake. "He's not under arrest. Just revisiting something." Leah offered Jake a careful, knowing look. "You've been to my group," she said. "You always sit near the window, never speak." Jake shrugged, embarrassed. "Didn't think I needed to." "You brought Blaze," Leah said, pointing to the capsule. "Every Tuesday, even if no one knew." Jake looked down. "I wasn't ready to talk." "And maybe you're still not," she said. "But the dog, he's saying things you can't." Ethan stepped back, letting the two of them stand with Ranger. The German shepherd remained between them like a sentry. Or maybe a translator. "No pressure," Leah added, kneeling beside Ranger. "But if you ever want to talk about Blaze, about Mosul, about what you carried home, I'll be here." Jake's voice cracked. "You think he forgives me? For not stopping him?" Leah didn't rush her answer. "I think he did his job, and he trusted you to carry the rest." The capsule sat between them, worn, warm, and full of unspeakable things. Ethan didn't interrupt. He didn't need to. Some silences didn't need to be broken. And for now, the warning had passed. But the guard remained. The air in the parking lot had grown heavier, not just from the sun, but from the silence that followed Jake's confession. Ranger still sat beside the capsule, unmoving. Ethan leaned against the truck now, arms crossed, watching the way Jake stared at the scorched metal cylinder as if it were both a relic and a wound. Across from them, Dr. Leah Monroe hadn't left. She remained crouched beside Ranger, her voice silent, but her presence unmistakably anchored. Sometimes healing began in the spaces between words. Jake finally spoke again, his voice hoarse. "Fallujah. It was a recon mission. Blaze wasn't even supposed to be with us that day. We had orders to rotate him out for rest, but something in my gut told me not to. He wouldn't leave my side anyway." Ethan remained quiet, letting Jake steer the memory. Jake continued. "We were pinned down in the North Quarter. Civilians nearby. Intel had us searching for a missing aid worker. What we didn't know was that the area had been mined earlier that week. Blaze found the first device by scent before anyone stepped near it. Saved the entire forward team." Dr. Monroe asked gently, "And the second?" Jake's eyes flicked to the horizon, distant and hollow. There wasn't a second warning. Not because he missed it, because he took it. We were clearing a compound when I lost visual. I heard the explosion before the command came over comms. It was instinct. He ran ahead, and it got him instead of me. Ranger let out a low, soft breath, as though even he understood the gravity of what had been spoken. "Most of him," Jake added, "was gone. But I found the tag, his collar, and part of his vest. We'd made a pact. If anything happened, we'd bring a piece home." No one spoke. It was not a silence of awkwardness, but reverence. Then the sound of a cart, while squeaking, interrupted the stillness. An elderly man in a tan maintenance uniform approached slowly, pushing a squeaky janitorial bin. He was in his late 70s, maybe older, with silver hair and a sun-damaged face that had long since forgotten vanity. His name tag read Reed Facilities. He walked with a subtle limp, and his left hand had a noticeable tremor, but his eyes, sharp and gray, missed nothing. "Did I hear you mention Fallujah?" Reed asked, his voice raspy but firm. Jake nodded but said nothing. Reed leaned his elbow on the handle of the bin and gave a half-smile. 1971. I was an Army field medic in Hue, Vietnam. Didn't have fancy dogs back then, not in our unit. But I owe my life to one. That made Ethan turn slightly. "A dog?" Reed nodded. His name was Smokey. Mutt, mostly shepherd. Stray that wandered into camp and wouldn't leave. He wasn't trained, not officially. But one day, he started howling outside the tent where I was prepping morphine kits. Wouldn't shut up. Drove me nuts. I stepped outside to calm him down. That's when the mortar hit. Reed tapped his chest. If he hadn't raised hell, I'd have been turned into splinters. After that, we kept him. The CO made it unofficial official. Smokey made it back to the States. Lived with a buddy of mine in Tennessee. Jake looked at Reed, and something passed between them. An invisible thread between two soldiers separated by decades, yet stitched with the same kind of grief, the same kind of gratitude. Reed's voice grew softer. They know. The dogs. Before we do, sometimes. Smokey didn't have training. He just knew when something bad was coming. Ethan watched as Jake's jaw tensed slightly. Blaze was like that. He'd step between me and danger before I even saw it. And I let him. I didn't even argue. Reed tilted his head. And he didn't expect you to. That's what they do. The two men stood facing each other, not as strangers now, but as survivors tethered by sacrifice. Ranger shifted and rested his head gently on his paws, eyes closed, as if the scene itself exhausted him emotionally. Dr. Monroe stood up. Jake, you said Blaze wasn't supposed to go with you that day. Did you ever regret taking him? Jake was quiet for a moment. Then, no. Regret's not the word. I've lived with guilt. Carried it like an extra lung. But regret? No. Because if I hadn't taken him, it would have been me. Or one of the guys. And Blaze wouldn't have had it any other way. Ethan finally spoke. Sometimes what breaks us isn't the event, it's the silence that follows. That's what Ranger helps me with. He doesn't let silence settle. He moves, he reacts, he remembers. Reed smiled faintly, a kind of weathered wisdom behind it. That's the thing with memory. It's not just in our heads. Sometimes it's buried in scent, in muscle, in instinct. Dogs carry it in ways we can't begin to understand. Ranger opened one eye and looked at Jake. And that look, gentle, deep, and unflinching, was all it took. Jake crouched down and, for the first time, placed both hands on the capsule. He didn't open it, didn't unwrap it, but the grip said everything. I think, Jake said, voice low, it's time I stopped just carrying him. It's time I start remembering him out loud. Reed gave a nod and started to push his cart again. As he rolled away, he called over his shoulder. That's what Smokey would have wanted too. The sound of the squeaky wheel faded into the quiet, and for the first time in a long time, Jake didn't feel like a man hiding something. He looked like someone preparing to tell the truth. By early afternoon, the Arizona sun had lost none of its bite. The parking lot outside the Flagstaff VA Medical Center shimmered in waves of heat. But for Jake Callahan, the world around him had begun to thaw, not from temperature, but from something more internal, more human. He stood beside his old Silverado, hands resting gently on the worn canvas of Blaze's memory capsule. Ranger lay at his feet, calm, his eyes half closed as if guarding a dream. Ethan leaned against the rear of the vehicle, silent, content to let the moment exist without commentary. Across from them, Dr. Leah Monroe had excused herself after a nod of quiet approval. The session wasn't over, but the groundwork was laid. Jake hadn't spoken about Blaze in a decade. Not to friends. Not to family. Not even to the fellow veterans who sat every Tuesday morning in a semicircle of folding chairs, coffee-stained paper cups in hand, trading truths and shadows while Jake sat silently against the back wall. He looked at Ranger. You remind me of him, he said, barely audible. Same eyes. Not just smart. Present. Ethan finally spoke. Ranger listens better than most people I know. Jake smiled, faint but real. Blaze didn't bark unless it mattered. Most dogs bark at movement. Blaze barked at silence. The kind that comes before something breaks. Ethan shifted. What was he like outside of the mission? Jake looked off toward the VA's entrance, where a stream of visitors passed through sliding doors. Gentle. More than I ever expected from a working dog. After hours, he'd lie on my cot and fall asleep with his head against my chest like a kid. The guys used to joke that he was the only one who could lower my blood pressure. Just then, the side doors of the VA clinic hissed open, and a young woman stepped out, glancing at a clipboard as she walked. She wore soft gray scrubs with a stethoscope slung loosely around her neck, curly black hair tucked into a bun, and sneakers that squeaked faintly with every step. She was in her late 20s, medium height, with almond eyes that always seemed to notice more than she said. Her badge read, Kayla Jenkins, RN. She slowed when she saw Jake and Ethan. "Hi, officer," she said to Ethan, then turned to Jake. "Mr. Callahan, I recognize you from the Tuesday groups. I'm Kayla. I usually help set up chairs and take the attendance list." Jake nodded awkwardly. "I'm not really in the group." "You're on the attendance," she said with a shrug, smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. "You sit by the window. That still counts." Jake raised an eyebrow. "I don't talk." "I've noticed," she replied. "But I've also noticed that you always bring that duffel. And you always hold it like it's not just gear." Jake's expression flickered. Kayla didn't push. She crouched beside Ranger and reached out a tentative hand. Ranger sniffed her fingers, then allowed her to scratch gently behind his ear. "I volunteered with therapy dogs in college," Kayla said. "I've always believed dogs can sense when we're carrying things we won't name." Jake studied her. "Do they teach you that in nursing school?" She chuckled. "No, but I've learned a few things just by paying attention. Like how people who bring silence into a room usually have the loudest stories." Ethan watched the interaction quietly, arms crossed. There was something delicate here, not fragile, but sacred. Jake looked down at the capsule again. Blaze wasn't just a soldier. He was a reminder that even in chaos, something could be calm. That not everything had to die to be lost. Kayla sat cross-legged now, Ranger resting his chin on her shoe. "You know, Mr. Callahan, there's no pressure to talk in the group. But if you ever did, I think a few people would listen harder than you expect. Especially if it started with Blaze." Jake rubbed the back of his neck, the lines in his face catching the sunlight. "I've thought about it. I sit in that room and hear guys talk about nightmares, guilt, pain. And all I can think is, if I start talking, I'll never stop." Kayla smiled. "Then don't stop. Sometimes people need to hear it. Sometimes they need someone brave enough to start." A gust of dry wind swept through the lot, rustling leaves along the edge of the curb. A woman passed by carrying a bouquet of sunflowers, nodding respectfully to the trio. Ranger watched her go, then turned back to Jake. Ethan stepped forward. "You know, it doesn't have to be today. But you've already started. That's more than most." Jake reached down and placed a hand on Ranger's neck. The dog pressed his head into the touch without flinching. "I used to believe that speaking would dishonor him, like letting go was the same as forgetting. But maybe holding it in is what dishonors him." Kayla stood and brushed dust from her pants. "If you ever want someone to sit next to you when you talk, I'll be there." Jake blinked at her, surprised. "You don't even know me." Kayla smiled. "I've been watching you sit with your silence for months. That's enough to know you're worth hearing." Ethan caught Jake's eye and gave a small nod. "It's time." Jake didn't respond with words. He reached down, picked up the capsule with both hands, and cradled it like a living thing. Then he looked toward the entrance of the VA building. His legs didn't move yet, but his eyes did. And that was how journeys began. The late afternoon sun was beginning its descent over Flagstaff, casting long amber shadows across the VA parking lot. The heat had mellowed into a dry warmth that wrapped itself around the buildings like a faded blanket. Ranger remained close to the truck, his body still and focused, his gaze locked on the canvas-wrapped capsule that now rested again on the hood of Jake's old Silverado. The concrete beneath them was warm, but the energy in the air was no longer tense. It was reverent, as though the world had paused to honor what was unfolding. Jake stood a few feet away, arms hanging loosely at his sides. His posture, once upright and guarded, had softened. His fingers twitched now and then, as if unsure whether to reach for something or let it go. His eyes were fixed on Ranger. Then, without sound or signal, the German shepherd stepped forward. Slow, deliberate. Each pawfall seemed almost ceremonial. He moved with the grace of something ancient and knowing, and when he reached the capsule, he lowered his head. Not quickly, not instinctively, but with the slow bend of a creature who understood ritual. His nose touched the canvas gently. He held it there for a moment, then exhaled, warm breath washing over the fabric like a silent blessing. Ethan watched from just behind, chest tightening unexpectedly. Jake's breath caught. He blinked once, and when the second came, tears had begun their slow, unrelenting descent. He didn't wipe them away. He didn't hide. For the first time in 10 years, he allowed them to fall. The sound that followed wasn't a sob, not a gasp, but a low, steady release, like a pressure valve finally yielding. Jake lowered himself beside Ranger, one knee on the warm pavement, his hand finding its way to the dog's flank. "You knew," he whispered, voice cracking. "You've always known." Ranger stayed still. Jake rested his forehead against the capsule, eyes squeezed shut. "I didn't know how to mourn him," he said softly, "so I didn't. I just carried him." Ethan didn't move, but in his mind, a memory rose like mist through trees. It had been winter in Prescott, 3 years earlier. Snow had fallen the night before, covering the roads in a thin crust of ice. Ethan had been patrolling with Skye, his first canine partner, a sable-coated shepherd with a playful spirit and an unmatched drive to work. They'd been responding to a rollover accident on a mountain road. Skye had spotted movement in the ravine before Ethan had. They'd both jumped down to assist the trapped driver. The second car came out of nowhere. The sound of impact had echoed in Ethan's bones for months. Skye had died instantly. Ethan had walked away with a fractured arm and a scar across his left cheekbone, but something deeper had broken that day. The department offered him a new dog 6 months later. He declined. It wasn't until a training session with a new handler class, watching a fresh pup lock eyes with his trainer, that he felt something stir again. And then he met Ranger. Now, seeing Ranger press his head to Blaze's memorial, Ethan found himself blinking away his own haze. Maybe dogs weren't just loyal. Maybe they were vessels, carriers of unspoken grief, silent translators of human sorrow. A soft voice interrupted the stillness. "You all right?" It was Leah Monroe, returning from inside, her voice cautious but kind. Jake didn't lift his head. "I am now." Leah stepped closer, kneeling down beside the two. There's something sacred about being witnessed when grief breaks through. Most men cry alone. You didn't. Jake finally looked up, eyes rimmed red but clear. "I didn't know I could still cry over him." "You didn't cry over him," she said gently. "You cried with him. That makes all the difference." Ethan stepped forward, crouched next to Ranger, and gave his partner a light scratch behind the ear. The dog flicked an ear in response, but didn't move away from the capsule. Leah glanced at Ethan. "Did you ever lose one?" He hesitated. "Skye. Rollover call. Hit and run. He saw the second car before I did." Leah nodded slowly. "And you carried that?" "Still do," he admitted. "But Rangers helped me carry it better." A door opened behind them. The quiet click of careful footsteps approached. It was Kayla Jenkins again, now holding 2 paper cups of iced tea, condensation dripping down the sides. "I figured it's time to cool down," she said with a soft smile, handing one to Jake. "For hydration, or distraction, whichever you need more." Jake accepted the drink, looking at her as though seeing her fully for the first time. "You came back." "I didn't leave far," she replied. "Just enough to let you have your moment." Ranger finally stepped back from the capsule, circled once, and sat down between Jake and Ethan. His head turned from one to the other, ears relaxed, body loose. It was the first time all day he looked like just a dog again. Not a sentinel, not a ghost keeper, just a creature offering quiet companionship. Kayla looked at the capsule. "Do you think Blaze would be okay with this? Being remembered like this?" Jake looked down at it, then nodded slowly. "Yeah, I think he'd want it. He always preferred silence, but he never let me walk alone in it." Leah placed a hand on Jake's shoulder. "Then maybe next Tuesday, you bring that silence into the room with us, and we'll carry it together." Jake didn't answer. He didn't need to. In the hush that followed, a hawk circled high above the VA building, casting a small, fleeting shadow across the group below. The moment passed, but what it left behind lingered, an understanding that grief, when honored, could be softened, and that sometimes the truest acts of remembrance began not with words, but with a dog gently lowering his head. By early evening, the VA parking lot had begun to empty. The sun stretched low behind the distant pines, casting long gold slants of light across the pavement, softening the day's sharp edges. Ethan Brooks stood near the rear of his cruiser, his notepad in one hand and a half-written incident report flickering on his patrol tablet in the other. The fields marked suspicious package, K9 alert, and investigation follow-up stared back at him like bureaucratic reminders of how simple things could be if emotion were never involved. But there was nothing simple about what had happened today. Ranger lay quietly at Jake Callahan's feet, his chest rising and falling with slow, rhythmic ease. The memory capsule rested between them on the truck's hood, untouched since Ranger's silent vigil. Jake sat on the tailgate, arms loose over his knees, hands knotted together, his shoulders no longer as tense. Something had eased in him, as if the weight had been acknowledged if not lifted. "You filing a report on this?" Jake asked, not accusatory, just curious. Ethan glanced down at his screen. "Technically I have to log the call. We had a K9 alert, a suspected suspicious object in a federal facility. That kind of thing usually sets off a string of paperwork." He paused, then tapped the screen once and sighed. "But the thing is, this isn't that kind of call." Jake raised an eyebrow. "You saying your dog was wrong?" "No," Ethan said simply. "I'm saying he was right, just not in a way the system understands." He tapped on the keyboard, deleting lines with quick, practiced strokes. When he finally settled on the summary field, he typed slowly and with deliberation. Object identified as personal memorial artifact. No threat detected. K9 displayed trained alert response due to trace organic memory imprint. Subject confirmed items emotional significance. No action required. Jake read the words as Ethan turned the screen to show him. "You sure that'll fly?" Ethan smirked. Most officers would have just called the bomb squad and moved on. But most officers don't know what it's like to lose a partner who didn't speak the same language, but understood every word. There was a moment of silence. Then Jake nodded. Blaze didn't talk either, but some days I felt like he knew what I was going to say before I said it. He had this habit. When I was getting too wound up, he'd come over and lean his whole body against me. Never barked, never pulled, just pressed in like he was telling me to stay here, not go too far into my head. Ethan smiled. "Ranger does that with my daughter." Jake blinked. "You have a kid?" Ethan nodded, the memory softening his tone. "Madeline. She's 7. My ex and I share custody. When she's over, Ranger sleeps outside her room. One night she had a nightmare and started crying, didn't even yell for me. But Ranger got up, nosed her door open, and lay beside her bed until she calmed down." Jake looked down at the dog. "How old is he?" "Just turned 5. Jake studied Ranger's eyes. "Feels older than that." "Yeah. Sometimes I think these dogs carry more than just commands. They carry echoes of every voice that ever called their name." Just then, a soft clatter behind them signaled the return of Kayla Jenkins. She walked slowly, holding a folded white cloth in one hand and a glass bottle of water in the other. Her scrubs were wrinkled now, and her hair had begun to escape its bun, curling against her jaw. There was a gentle empathy to the way she moved, like someone who had learned not to rush sorrow. "I thought you might want this," she said, handing Jake the cloth. "For the capsule. Something cleaner than the wrap. No pressure." Jake took it carefully. "Thanks." Kayla crouched beside Ranger and brushed some dust from his back. "He's beautiful. You ever train him yourself?" Ethan shook his head. "He came to me from a retired handler. Said the dog was too intuitive for her. He started ignoring commands and just doing what he thought was right. That's usually grounds for retraining or retirement. But when I took him out on a test run, he led me to a runaway hiding behind a dumpster behind a diner. We weren't even on that call." Jake chuckled softly. "So he's disobedient in the right way." "That's what got him assigned to me," Ethan said. "Someone figured a guy with a messy heart might do okay with a dog who doesn't follow the rules." Kayla looked up. "Sounds like you both found what you needed." Jake opened the cloth slowly, wrapping it around the capsule with careful fingers. His hands were strong but gentle, as if he were dressing a wound that still pulsed under the skin. When he finished, he held it close to his chest, eyes closed. You think dogs remember after they're gone? He asked suddenly. Ethan didn't answer right away. Ranger lifted his head and looked at Jake, eyes calm and soft. I think, Ethan said, they leave something behind in us. Something we don't know is there until the next dog walks in and picks it up like a baton. Jake stared at Ranger, then reached down and laid a hand on the dog's neck. I keep thinking Blaze is still trying to tell me something. Ranger let out a low hum, not a growl, not a whine. A sound of recognition. Ethan stepped back. Then maybe he is. Jake looked at the capsule again. Then maybe I should start listening. Ranger lay down once more beside the capsule, placing his chin beside the cloth-wrapped bundle, his eyes not on the object but on Jake. Not watching, not guarding, just being. And in that stillness something was heard, not with ears but with something older. Something both men understood in their bones. Tuesday morning came with a quiet gentleness. The air in Flagstaff had cooled overnight, and now a soft breeze moved through the grounds of the VA Medical Center, rustling the pine needles overhead and bringing with it the faint scent of early autumn. Inside the building, down a hallway decorated with faded photographs of service dogs and soldiers, room B12 stood open. Folding chairs had been arranged in a wide circle, a tray of paper cups and coffee resting on a table at the back. Kayla Jenkins moved about the room with a quiet efficiency. Her scrubs were navy blue today, her hair pulled into a long braid over one shoulder. She moved the chairs a few inches farther apart, not for space but for comfort. She had learned that even small gaps mattered when the wounds weren't visible. Her eyes flicked to the clock, 8:59 a.m. At exactly 9, the first of the veterans walked in. A tall man with a prosthetic leg and a gray crew cut offered Kayla a nod before settling into his usual chair. Then came Leonard, a retired Navy mechanic who always brought a notebook but never spoke. Soon, a dozen chairs were filled. And then Jake Callahan stepped through the door. He wore a dark green jacket over a plain black tee, jeans with a crease at the knees from old habit. But what drew every eye in the room wasn't his presence. It was what he carried, the memory capsule. Wrapped in clean white cloth, cradled carefully in both hands, it looked almost like a sacred relic. Jake paused just inside the threshold. Kayla offered him a quiet smile and gestured to an open seat. Without speaking, he crossed the room and sat. Ranger was beside him. Ethan had received special clearance to bring the K-9 into this particular session. The German shepherd sat calmly at Jake's feet, his tail still, his gaze steady. The group leader, Martin Reyes, nodded to Jake as he took his seat. Martin was a broad-shouldered man in his late 50s, with salt and pepper hair and kind eyes that hid behind wire-rimmed glasses. A retired Army chaplain, Martin had a way of listening that made people speak without fear. His voice was calm, always carrying the gravity of someone who'd seen both heaven and hell in equal measure. We usually start with a check-in, Martin said. But today, if it's all right, I'd like to give the floor to someone who's brought something important with him. All eyes turned to Jake. He didn't speak immediately. His hand rested on the capsule, his thumb brushing a seam in the cloth. I never planned on talking, he said at last. His voice was rough, low, but steady. For over 10 years, I came close to telling this story. But it felt too big, too heavy. Like if I said it out loud, I'd fall apart before I reached the end. No one interrupted. This, Jake held up the capsule slightly, is Blaze. Or what's left of him. A ripple moved through the room. Not shock, but recognition. The kind of silence that forms when people understand grief without needing explanation. Jake continued. He was my K-9 partner. Fallujah, 2010. Tactical missions. Explosives detection. But he wasn't just a working dog. He was the only living thing that stayed beside me when everything else fell apart. He paused, fingers tightening on the cloth. He died saving us. No warning. He went forward before I gave the order. Took the hit. We didn't find much. But I took what I could. Made this. Wrapped it. Carried it. And never told anyone what it was. Ranger shifted, resting his head on Jake's boot. I thought holding on to the pain was loyalty, Jake said. But now I think silence dishonors what he gave. One by one, The veterans around the circle leaned forward, not in judgment, but in solidarity. Martin asked gently, "What made you decide to speak today?" Jake looked down at Ranger. "A dog I didn't know, who sat down at the right time." Several people nodded. One of the women, Karen Wallace, who rarely spoke in sessions, reached into her pocket and pulled out a dog tag on a chain. "My brother's," she said. "He died in Afghanistan. I've never talked about him, but I've carried this for 9 years." Her voice cracked, but she didn't stop. "Maybe it's time I said his name." Others followed. A man named Russ, who had always stared at the floor during meetings, spoke about a night ambush in Iraq. A woman named Joan shared a story of losing her medic partner to friendly fire. By the time the clock hit 10, every person in the room had said something they hadn't planned on saying. Ethan stood quietly in the back, watching it unfold, arms folded. Ranger remained still beside Jake, as if he knew his presence was no longer necessary as a sentinel, only as a witness. After the session ended, the room thinned out slowly. Jake remained in his seat, the capsule now resting in his lap, unwrapped. Kayla approached him. "You did it." Jake gave a tired smile. "No, we did." As she turned to leave, Kayla handed Ethan a sealed envelope. "This came through interoffice this morning. From me, technically, but I wanted it to be a surprise." Ethan opened it later, alone in the quiet of his cruiser. It was a handwritten note, short but clear. "Dear Officer Brooks and Ranger, some souls break in silence. But sometimes, all it takes is one dog sitting down at the right moment for an entire soul to stand back up. Thank you for staying when others walked past, for knowing when to be still, and for reminding us that healing doesn't need permission, only presence." Kayla Ethan closed the note gently and reached back to scratch behind Ranger's ear. The dog blinked up at him, tail wagging once, slow, solid, complete. The morning had begun like any other in late autumn. Clear skies, cool air, and a light breeze stirring golden leaves across the courtyard behind the Flagstaff VA Medical Center. But for Jake Callahan, this morning carried weight. The annual Veterans Memorial Service wasn't just a tradition. This time, it was a turning point. He arrived early, long before the chairs were filled. Dressed in the same green jacket he had worn to his therapy group, now pinned with the small gold paw print Kayla had given him, he carried the white cloth-wrapped capsule with both hands. This time, he didn't clutch it like a secret. He carried it like an offering. He chose a seat in the front row, his movements slow but resolute. He placed the capsule gently on his lap and sat with his back straight, legs still. Ranger settled beside him without being told, lowering himself to the ground and resting his chin on his paws, body aligned with Jake's like a silent second heartbeat. To Jake's left sat Ethan Brooks, polished in uniform, but notably more relaxed than usual. His hand brushed Ranger's back briefly before he folded his arms and looked ahead. He had been to many memorials, some formal, some personal, but none that began quite like this. At 9:30 sharp, the crowd was called to order by a bell chime. The speaker for the event was Brigadier General Helen Marsh Rhett, a woman in her early 70s with short white hair, square shoulders, and eyes that had long since learned to hold their emotion without drowning in it. She wore her dress blues, every ribbon polished and placed with perfect care. "Today," she said, voice carrying easily across the quiet crowd, "we gather not only to honor those who served in uniform, but to recognize the silent companions who walked beside them, often unnoticed but never forgotten." Murmurs rippled gently through the audience. Older veterans nodded solemnly, while some younger ones looked down, suddenly caught in private memories. General Marsh continued, "For the first time, this memorial recognizes K-9 military units who served alongside our forces, dogs who ran into fire, tracked the missing, and guarded our lives when we were too weary to guard ourselves." Jake's jaw clenched. His eyes stared ahead, unmoving. Some were brought home. Some were not. All were warriors. There was a long pause. Then she added softly, "If anyone here wishes to name such a companion, you are welcome to stand." Jake hesitated. A heartbeat. Then another. Ethan didn't look at him, but he could feel the tension building beside him like a rising tide. Jake rose. It wasn't dramatic. He didn't raise his voice or step forward. He simply stood, the capsule still in his hands. The crowd turned slightly, quiet as snowfall. His name, Jake said, voice gravel-thick but clear, was Blaze. He didn't say more. He didn't need to. Silence followed, but it wasn't empty. It was filled with recognition, a ripple of invisible nods from those who understood what it meant to speak a fallen name into the world. General Marsh nodded in return. "Thank you, Mr. Callahan." Jake sat down slowly, his breath uneven but steady. His hands returned to the capsule, but now they rested loosely over it, protective but no longer clenched. The ceremony continued with wreath laying, the playing of taps, and a reading of names. But to Ethan, the most sacred part had already passed. He didn't focus on the speeches. He focused on Ranger. The dog had not moved during Jake's moment. But now, as the American flag overhead was lowered slightly, Ethan caught something in Ranger's posture, a shift in his breathing, the way his ears flicked toward the sound of the bugle. In Ranger's presence, Ethan felt the weight of every K9 who had come before: Sky, Blaze, Max, Echo, Luna. Names he had heard in passing, stories carried on wind between handlers like prayer. And for a moment, the courtyard didn't feel like a space in front of a hospital. It felt like hallowed ground. When the ceremony ended, people rose in quiet waves. A few saluted. A few wept. Some stayed rooted in place, hands gripping the backs of their chairs, as if unsure how to leave such a sacred silence behind. Jake remained seated. Kayla approached quietly from the back, dressed in a dark coat and simple slacks, a small bundle of white roses cradled in her arm. She walked to Jake without a word, crouched beside him, and laid the flowers gently beside the capsule. "They're not just for Blaze," she said. "They're for the silence you carried." Jake blinked, but the tears didn't fall this time. Ethan stood back, letting them have the moment. A few feet away, a small boy, no older than 6, with messy blonde hair and a red hoodie, approached Ranger. He was led by his mother, a petite woman in her 30s named Claire Dunning, whose late husband had served 2 tours in Afghanistan. Her son, Toby, had struggled with speech since his father's funeral 2 years earlier. Ranger looked up. Toby hesitated, eyes wide, then slowly reached out. Ranger nudged his hand gently, and the boy smiled. Claire whispered to Ethan, "He hasn't touched a dog since our retriever passed, but he said he wanted to today." Ethan crouched to Ranger's level. He always knows which ones are ready. Toby leaned in, resting his small forehead against Ranger's. For a few seconds, they remained like that, 2 souls understanding something too big for language. And when Toby finally stepped back, he turned to his mother and whispered a single word: "Safe." Claire gasped, covering her mouth. Ethan swallowed hard, eyes stinging. Later, as the crowd dispersed and the chairs were folded, Jake stood with Ethan and Ranger one last time. "Didn't expect to say it," Jake murmured. "His name." Out loud. Ethan smiled. "Sometimes the right moment finds you, whether you're ready or not." Jake looked at Ranger. "He held it for me, until I could carry it right." Ethan nodded. "That's what they do." They parted without ceremony. But as Jake walked away, capsule in one hand, roses in the other, Ranger watched him go, ears relaxed, body still. And Ethan, watching Ranger, saw them all. Every dog who had ever stayed behind when bullets flew. Everyone who waited quietly by the door that would never open again. They were here. They had never really left. Not in this place. Not with these people. Not in dogs like Ranger, who knew exactly when to sit down and exactly when to stand. The early winter sun spilled gold across the red rock ridges beyond Flagstaff, filtering through frost-lined windows of the small public library near the VA center. Inside, Jake Callahan sat hunched at a wide oak table, a steaming mug of black coffee near his elbow, and a soft-bound notebook laid open in front of him. He wrote slowly, his pen thick between fingers that still trembled from time to time, not with fear now, but with purpose. Blaze. That was the first word on the page. He had written it dozens of times over the past weeks, but now it stood not as a name whispered in grief, but as the title of a story. A real story. His story. The book wasn't just about war. It wasn't just about a dog. It was about silence and memory, about how healing sometimes arrived on four legs and waited until you were ready. Ethan Brooks arrived quietly, setting a paper bag of breakfast biscuits on the table and nodding toward the notebook. "You finally putting it down for good?" Jake smiled, a softness in his face that hadn't existed a month ago. "For good? No. But for now? Yeah. I think it's time." Ranger stood beside Ethan, tail swaying gently. He'd gained a quiet fame around town since the memorial, known now in whispers and laughter as the dog who doesn't bark but makes you cry anyway. Veterans and nurses called him the Silent Sentinel. But Jake preferred something simpler. "Memory keeper," he had said once. "That's what he is. He keeps the memory until you're brave enough to face it." Ranger padded over to Jake and laid his head gently on the man's lap. Jake's hands stopped moving. He looked down, met Ranger's amber eyes, and gave a short nod. That afternoon, they walked together across the campus to the new recovery wing at the Flagstaff VA. The building wasn't big, but its walls were warm with handmade art, flags, and framed photos. The main common room had been set up for a special program, Jake's idea, with support from Kayla and Ethan. Every Thursday now, Jake would speak. Sometimes just a few words. Sometimes just reading from what he'd written. And Ranger would sit, silent but magnetic, drawing people toward a space they didn't know they needed. That day, a young veteran named Marcus was led into the room. He was lean, with sharp eyes and a stiff jaw that looked permanently clenched. His gait was uneven, one leg dragged slightly from a roadside bomb years back, but what struck Jake most was his silence. Not cautious silence, not polite, but hollow. Kayla walked beside him. She wore her usual soft blue scrubs and an oversized cardigan that trailed behind her like a whisper. She had a gentle presence, the kind that made you feel seen without pressure. She looked toward Jake and Ethan. "This is Marcus Lane, Army medic, Kabul Unit 18. He hasn't spoken to a group yet." Jake didn't reply. He didn't need to. Ranger stepped forward. Slowly. Intentionally. Marcus stiffened, eyes darting to Kayla, then back to Ranger. The dog stopped a foot away. Sat down. Didn't bark. Didn't tilt his head. Just waited. Something in Marcus's chest shifted. You could almost see it. A breath he didn't realize he was holding escaped him, long and trembling. And then he sat, right there on the floor. Ranger moved forward, laid his body beside Marcus, not touching, just near enough. Marcus whispered, "I used to have one." Jake nodded. "So did I." And in that stillness, healing began again. Not loudly, not with applause, but with presence. After the session, Marcus lingered by the window, speaking to Kayla in hushed tones. Outside, snow began to fall in slow, soft spirals. Jake stood with Ethan by the coffee table in the corner. "You think it'll last?" he asked. Ethan handed him a biscuit. "Doesn't matter. The moment happened. That's what counts." Jake took a bite. "Funny. I carried Blaze in a capsule for 10 years, and I never realized I was supposed to release him." "You didn't release him," Ethan said, his voice steady. "You shared him. Big difference." Over the next weeks, their small group became a routine. Ethan kept coming on his off days, in uniform or not. Jake spoke more confidently, reading excerpts of what would become his memoir, Blaze, the Dog Who Waited. Kayla coordinated new arrivals, pairing veterans with group moments that weren't therapy, not officially, but more effective than any worksheet ever printed. Ranger, as always, was at the center of it, a presence without ego, a shadow that carried warmth. One morning, a woman named Sarah Givens joined the group. She was tall, wiry, in her mid-40s, with long auburn hair, usually tied in a high ponytail. Her body language screamed efficiency, quick steps, sharp turns, but her eyes betrayed a storm. Sarah had once been a Coast Guard rescue diver, a woman forged in survival, shaped by loss. After losing her partner during a hurricane mission, she had shut down completely. She never talked much, but she watched Ranger like he was a lighthouse. A week later, she brought a one-eyed cat named Murphy to the session. No one asked why. Murphy settled next to Ranger, like they had always known each other. Kayla looked over and laughed quietly. Healing's getting crowded. Jake smiled. Let it. There's room. That night, Jake sat at his kitchen table, staring at a single page on his laptop screen. The dedication. He typed slowly. For Blaze. And for every silent companion who held our pain without asking. We are never alone. He hit save. And in the corner of the room, Ranger stirred in his sleep, as if even dreams knew this journey had finally found its home. Sometimes, miracles don't come with thunder or blinding light from the heavens. Sometimes they arrive in the quiet way a dog chooses to sit, in the silent gaze of a veteran burdened by memory, or in the soft touch upon a small metal capsule carrying the soul of a fallen companion. Blaze wasn't just a military dog's name. He became a symbol of unconditional love, loyalty beyond death, and the kind of healing only God can plant in our hearts through life's simplest gestures. In our everyday lives, we often overlook the souls silently waiting to be heard, an old friend, a grieving family member, or even our own heart. Let the story of Jake, Ethan, Ranger, and Blaze remind us that God never abandons us. He sends his angels in unexpected forms, sometimes as a broken soldier, sometimes as a dog that simply knows when to sit still. If you believe love and memory never die, please share this story to help others feel the power of silent healing and loyalty. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next miracle. Pray that God blesses all those silently carrying invisible wounds. Leave a comment with the word Amen if you believe God sends angels, sometimes through a dog's quiet bark. Amen.